Okay, so I guess I should welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. I suspect there'll be some more people arriving in the next few minutes, but we might as well just get started. So today we're very happy to join forces, the Center for Urban Science and Progress, the Tandon School of Engineering, together with the Urban Initiative, which is an NYU initiative looking at urban research and urban problems. To welcome Sharad Goel to be our joint speaker today. It's very exciting. I think he ticks many of the boxes in his research that brings these two crowds together. I just wanted to welcome everyone. Happy to host this in the usual COSP spot and to bring these communities together. For those of you in the Urban Initiative that don't know us, COSP is sort of the Science and Technology Center focus on urban issues, so we want to connect with you, we want to learn with you from you, find opportunities to explore synergies in between the multiple disciplines involved in this conversation. So yeah, welcome everyone, and I'll pass the stage to Mariana Veras, who is one of the urban fellows of NYU, and who'll be introducing our speaker today. So thank you so much everyone for joining.
Thank you, Juan, for welcoming the urban, the other urban centers into your urban center. So I just want to say, I know we all are so very excited to have Professor Sharad Goel here with us today. As you may have read in the note, Sharad is an assistant professor at Stanford in the Department of Management, Science, and Engineering, with courtesy appointments in computer science, sociology, and the law school. And I think that's a testament to his interdisciplinary approach to research. He's also the founder and director of the Stanford Computational Policy Lab, which is a group that develops technology to tackle pressing issues in criminal justice, education, voting rights, and beyond. And in the past year alone, Sharad, obviously with a number of co-authors, has published research demonstrating racial bias in voice recognition algorithms, participated in a debate on statistical estimates of discrimination in the criminal justice system, which I think he seems to have won, and seen the culmination of years of arduous public records requests result in the largest ever study of police bias against Black and Hispanic drivers. And on top of all of that, he's made time to demonstrate the rarity of double voting, which I think we're all grateful for having a citation at this point, and to push the San Francisco District Attorney to stop using sentencing enhancements. So Sharad, we're so very grateful to have you with us today, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks so much for that introduction, and everyone for joining us today. Let me see if I can share my screen. Great. Is that showing up? Great. Terrific. Hopefully it's not too loud. Can you hear the garbage truck outside my house? Hopefully not one of the problems with Zooming. Okay, so today I want to tell you a little bit about our work over the last several years on quantifying bias in human and machine decisions. And I'll try to keep this pretty informal. So please feel free to ask questions anytime. I might not completely monitor chat, but feel free to interrupt anytime for questions, and I'm happy to answer those as they come. So just for a little bit of context, as was mentioned in the introduction, that I started and direct the Computational Policy Lab at Stanford. And in many ways, our goals are very similar to those of CUSP in that we're trying to have impact beyond the university using these ideas from computer science and statistics. And it's definitely a little bit of it's an unusual model, and one that one of the reasons that I really like the work that's going on in CUSP, that pushing this impact beyond traditional paper writing and trying to have broader impact. And so the way we do this is with an interdisciplinary team of researchers, staff engineers, and journalists that use ideas from computer science and statistics to drive reform in a variety of contemporary policy domains, including criminal justice, education, and healthcare. And I'm going to frame a lot of the discussion today in terms of criminal justice applications, but many of the ideas are much broader and apply to these other domains. So when we take on projects, we often, or at least I often conceptualize them in three distinct but interrelated pieces. The first is data collection and integration, the second is data analysis, and then the third are direct tools and interventions to reduce many of the disparities that we often detect using these statistical methods. So I'm going to tell you today a little bit about all of these three buckets. So just to give you a preview, on the data collection side, I'll talk a bit about our open policing project. This is something we've been doing for the last 6-7 years at this point, and we've collected and released over 100 million records of traffic stops across the country. I'll describe, most of my time I'm going to use to describe some of the methods that we're using to analyze that particular data set, and then also algorithms, and so looking both at human bias and then also algorithmic bias. And then finally, in the last few minutes, I'll briefly touch on some of the interventions that we've recently deployed in San Francisco and in other jurisdictions to reduce inequality. So with that, I'll jump right into measuring bias in human decisions. So as a motivating example, I wanted to think about police officers' searches of vehicles. So when an officer pulls over an individual, they have discretion to conduct a search for contraband. And the pertinent question here, the one that I'm going to look at, is asking whether or not officers hold all drivers to that same search standard, irrespective of race, or alternatively, whether they're for example, searching Black or Hispanic drivers on the basis of less evidence, which would be considered illegal discriminatory police behavior. So perhaps the simplest test for discrimination, and in one that you see reported all the time in the media, is asking whether or not white and Black drivers are searched at similar rates. And now, for simplicity, I'm going to focus on these two groups for now, but later we'll expand a bit. But so the question again is, are white and Black drivers searched at similar rates? And if you see that, for example, the search rate for Black drivers is higher, that might indicate a lower and discriminatory bar for searching those drivers. So very simple idea. You see this reported all over the place. I think it gives us a lot of intuition about the dynamics of what's happening in these stops. But without more information, it could also be the case that at least in theory, hypothetically, white and Black drivers are being held to the same search standard, but more Black drivers are simply above that search threshold. Sorry, is there a question? Oh.
A reminder, everyone, please your microphone.
So again, the idea here is that white and Black drivers could be in theory held to the same standard, but it's possible. Sorry, I'm just I'm still hearing a little bit of audio. I'm not sure if that's great. Terrific, thanks. Please feel free to ask questions anytime. Now, again, it could be in theory that white and Black drivers are being held to the same standard, but it's possible that more Black drivers are simply above the search threshold.
I'm not asking whether you fired someone, but I'm asking whether you have a measure of how or the savings, in other words.
I'm sorry, I'm not quite hearing the question. I'm not sure if that was an intentional or inadvertent audio. Okay, maybe we can continue and but feel free to either put questions in the chat or unmute yourself. Okay, so now without more information, we don't quite know what's going on, and so this is a version of what's commonly called omitted variable bias. And the problem is that it's hard in theory to account for all the factors that might be affecting an officer's decision of whether or not to search someone. And so there's this very clever workaround that was introduced by Gary Becker. And he flipped the question on its head, and he's saying, let's not look at search rates, the rate at which these searches are conducted, but let's instead look at search outcomes, what are called hit rates, so search success rates. And the idea here is that a lower search success rate for Black drivers suggests that standard of searching was lower. So let me give you, so this is it's a little bit confusing, but it's a clever, very nice idea. So let me illustrate this by an extreme example. Let's say that when black drivers are searched, officers find contraband 10% of the time, but when white drivers are searched, officers find contraband 90% of the time. Now, intuitively, what does that suggest? That suggests that officers were searching white drivers when they're really quite certain that they would find something, but they're searching black drivers only when there's a whiff of evidence, when they don't really have that strong basis to conduct that search. So in this case, we would say there's a double standard, and in that particular example, there is discrimination against black drivers. Okay, so it's a very clever test that purports to get around omitted variable bias. But what I'm going to argue now is that even though this feels quite intuitive, there's actually a subtle statistical issue with this argument, and then I'm going to address how we can mitigate that statistical issue. Okay, so let's do this in pictures. So now, officers, when they see a vehicle, they might ask, well, what is the chance that the driver here has contraband? You see this minivan, this family, and you're like, okay, well, maybe this is a relatively low chance. Now you see this this single driver, and maybe you're like, okay, still low, but maybe a little bit higher. Now you see this older couple. It's like, okay, relatively low. You see the VW bus coming around. Maybe it's a little bit higher. And now you see this guy who's clearly intoxicated, and it's quite high. Okay, you basically have clear view evidence of contraband. So we see all these drivers, and you could think in your mind that this is a little bit far-fetched, but an officer has fit this logistic regression, this model in their head. They're seeing these cars come through and just like making these probability judgments. Okay, so that's what the officer is doing, and now we have this distribution of judgments over all the vehicles that the officer is encountering, and so we just have this distribution. So this is what I'm going to call our risk distribution, and this is the main object I want to study for much of the rest of the talk. So I just want to pause for a minute and check that we're on the same page of what this thing is. And so imagine the way we compute it. It's like, again, this is a little bit of we're using our imagination a bit. And so an officer comes around, they have this model, they see a driver, they compute this estimate, and now each of those estimates is a point on this histogram that's implied here, and we're looking at a distribution over a population. Okay, so it's a distribution of probability estimates over a population. So I just want to pause for a second and see if there are any questions about this object, because we'll be talking about this for the next half hour or so.
One other question. Are we assuming here that the probability of stops are equal across the race of drivers, or are you going to relax that?
No, we're not going to make any assumptions there. We're also, this is a very good point, that we're only going to be looking at discrimination in the search decision among stops drivers. So all sorts of discriminatory behavior may have happened before that search decision. For example, this could be where officers decide to patrol, what neighborhoods officers decide to patrol in. It could be which cars are pulled over, but we're going to not talk about that type of discrimination. We're only going to talk about discrimination in that narrow search decision. Okay?
Thanks.
Okay, so now if I give you one, this is one population. If I give you another population, it can vary in different ways. So here are the estimates of probability of carrying contraband in another population. It has a different mean, indicating a different base rate of carrying contraband in that population. It can also have a different variance, meaning that this mean is the same, but it's harder in this red population to figure out who has contraband and who doesn't have contraband. So lower variance means everyone in the population is close to average, so I can't easily tell who is likely to be carrying contraband and who is less likely to be carrying contraband. Okay, so now let's think about the problem with our outcome test. And for simplicity, let's think of this example where we have two populations, and later we can think of this as white drivers and black drivers, but right now I'm abstracting it away to just two populations. And they have the same base rate for carrying contraband, 30%, but the distribution itself is a little bit different. And now the officer's rule for searching is search drivers if there's a 50% chance that they'll find contraband. So this is a facially neutral, non-discriminatory policy. The officer is saying for every individual, regardless of race, Let's search them if there's at least a 50% chance of finding contraband. And now what's going to happen? What is the outcome test going to do in this case? It's going to say conditional on being searched, conditional on being to the right of this dashed line. What's the likelihood of finding contraband? Well, it's 55% in this particular picture. I'm telling you the numbers. It's 55% for the red group, but it's higher for the blue group. It's 60%. And that means that the outcome test is going to suggest a bias against the red group, even though we've just said that all individuals are held to the exact same standard. And so what's going on here is that the blue group has this tail of individuals who are very likely to be carrying contraband that pushes that mean up, even though every driver is being held to the same standard. Okay? And so this is one of the issues with the outcome test. We can also think of it in this reverse way, where now we have two thresholds, one for blue drivers and one for red drivers. Blue drivers in this example are being searched on the basis of less evidence than red drivers. They're searched at 45% versus red drivers are being searched at 50%. So we think of this as a discriminatory double standard against blue drivers. But if we look at the hit rates, the search success rates, they're both 55%. And why is that? Even though that threshold was lower for blue drivers, that bigger tail pushes that mean up. And so the outcome test incorrectly tells us that there's no discrimination, even though there is discrimination. Okay, so again, in theory, this is what can go wrong, and this is what's known as a problem of inframarginality, that our notion of discrimination has to do with what's happening at the threshold itself, but these types of inframarginal statistics deal with what's going on in the tails as well. And so when we integrate over the entire distribution, we lose precision about what's happening at that threshold, which is our notion of discrimination. Okay, so this is our problem of inframarginality. And now I want to talk a little bit about how we can address this. So I'm only going to give you a little bit of intuition here about what might be going on, or how we our proposed solution for addressing this. And the idea is that we have used the observed search success rates, these hit rates, the same way that Becker suggested, but we're also going to couple that with the search rates themselves. And then we're going to pair both of those with an analysis of these patterns across multiple jurisdictions. And the idea is when we have these two statistics, the search rates and the hit rates across multiple jurisdictions, we can simultaneously piece together the underlying risk distributions, which we don't observe, and also the search thresholds, which we don't observe. So that's the idea, that we're kind of putting together this puzzle. We get to see all of these little pieces, and then we're going to try to create a distribution and thresholds that recover all of those little pieces. So in a simplified case, let's imagine that I tell you there's a single risk distribution underneath all of these different jurisdictions. I don't tell you what it is. I just tell you that there's a single risk distribution. And I tell you that there are a bunch of thresholds. Again, I don't tell you where these things are. You can imagine, well, if I see enough jurisdictions with enough thresholds, I can piece together everything. That's the idea. And this is a simplified version. In practice, we have multiple risk distributions and multiple thresholds. So this is a significantly harder statistical problem to deal with. And I won't go into the details there, but the idea is once we assume some kind of regularity, some smoothness across these jurisdictions, we can still piece this thing together in a way that lets us recover both the risk distributions and the thresholds.
Can I ask a quick question?
Mm-hmm. Yes, please.
You're only looking at the driver's race when you do this analysis?
Yes.
So you're not looking at, for example, the vehicle type, any information about the vehicle, any information about other characteristics other than the driver?
Exactly. And so the point here is that the outcome test, or outcome tests in general, are designed to circumvent traditional omitted variable bias, in that we're not trying to model the decision directly, and so we have to account for all the different factors that might influence an officer's decision. We're just saying we know what happened. we know whether or not they were successful, an officer was successful at the end of the day, and then we can determine from whether or not something was successful, whether the same standard was being applied. And so this is kind of this clever switch or this clever observation that Becker made of how we can try to get around this omitted variable bias. Okay, so now let's look at some data. And let's look at 5 million traffic stops in North Carolina. And just to warm up, I want to show you the traditional hit rate analysis. This is Becker style analysis, looking at search success rates. And here I've disaggregated by Black drivers and Hispanic drivers. Each point here is a jurisdiction. And let's start out with Hispanic drivers. And so here we can see that all of these jurisdictions, these are the 100 largest cities in North Carolina. Each of these points is below the diagonal line, meaning that in all of these places, the hit rate, the search success rate for Hispanic drivers is lower than the success rate for white drivers. So that is evidence of a lower search standard for Hispanic drivers. Now, so that's like kind of consistent with what we might expect, but now we look over at the same analysis for Black drivers, and what we see is that almost everything is right along this diagonal. Now, the point here is that if we were to take the conventional Becker-style interpretation, we'd say there's no evidence of discrimination, that it looks like search success rates are similar across jurisdictions for white drivers and Black drivers in North Carolina, and so we don't find evidence of discrimination. But now, so this again was a traditional analysis. So now if we switch to our threshold analysis, where we're trying to infer the thresholds themselves, not just the search success rates, what we see here is that the thresholds are below the diagonal in both of these cases. So what does that mean? That we're inferring that in almost all of these jurisdictions, for both Black drivers and Hispanic drivers, the threshold for searching minority drivers is lower than the threshold for searching white drivers, which again is evidence of a discriminatory double standard. And this is a pattern that we would have missed doing this traditional hit rate analysis. So what's going on here? I mean, this is, these are kind of complicated models. It's like, are we, it's certainly possible that we're missing something and that this is really an artifact of our modeling procedure. I don't think it is. And in our paper, we go into several robustness checks. We're trying to convince ourselves that this is a real pattern that we're observing. But right now, I just want to give you one highlight of that type of analysis for why I personally believe these results. So let's look at Raleigh, the state capital, where the Black hit rate, the hit rate for Black drivers is 16%, versus the hit rate for white drivers is 13%. So this means that the hit rate for white drivers is lower, which by a traditional interpretation would mean that there's a discriminatory double standard against white drivers. So not only is there no discrimination, in Raleigh, this evidence would point to discrimination against white drivers. So at the very least, that seems unusual. That's like not what one would expect. And so what's going on here? Well, if we look at the results from our threshold test, here are the inferred risk distributions, and here are the inferred search thresholds. So what we see here is that the search thresholds for Black drivers are lower. The search threshold for Black drivers is lower than the search threshold for white drivers, but the hit rate is higher because we have this heavier tail in the risk distribution. So this is what our test is indicating, that it's finding a lower search threshold for Black drivers in Raleigh, indicating discrimination against Black drivers. At the same time, it's finding a heavier tail, which shows that inframarginality, or suggests that inframarginality is actually driving this funny statistical result that we saw a minute ago. So now we can ask, well, why is it? I mean, is this for real? Is there actually this heavier tail of risk for Black drivers? And again, it's hard to know for sure, but at least a little bit of evidence in the data that points to this being the case is that Black drivers in Raleigh are 3 times more likely to be carrying contraband in what's known as plain view. And so this is something that officers indicate on their forms, whether or not the basis for their search was plain view of contraband. It's not something that the test itself knows anything about. We don't feed that information to the test. The test is just able to detect this heavier tail. But if we look in the data, we see that many of these searches for black drivers, 3 times as many, are for this plain view evidence of contraband, which is associated with these higher probabilities of actually recovering contraband at the end of the day. So again, this is all circumstantial. We don't know for sure if this is what's going on, but the evidence suggests that this explanation is consistent with all these pieces of information. Okay, so
I have a question, if you don't mind.
Yes,
just to make sure I'm following here. So it may or may not make sense. So sorry about that beforehand. So I'm thinking that you may have like a lower threshold if you think that for certain people it's going to be easier for you to find something, right? Because that's easier to justify, right? Like the fact that if I search is more likely that I'm going to find something, and so because you're saying that conditional on being searched, like the probability of finding something is larger, that may encourage me to actually change the threshold just because I believe like people are carrying stuff in plain sight, so I think it's more likely for me to find something. So could that be like an alternative explanation for the fact that the thresholds are different, or that doesn't make sense at all?
So I think it's a good idea. I would say really what we're modeling is the likelihood that you're going to find something at the end of the day. And the argument is that what does discrimination mean is that if I give you 2 people who have the same likelihood of finding something at the end of the day, if you conduct a search, you're more likely to search that black driver in that case. Alternatively, I can say, even if I have less likelihood of finding something for one person, for a black driver compared to a white driver, I'm still going to search that black driver. That's this idea of this double standard.
What I'm trying to say here is like what could be confounded here is the threshold, right? Like the thing that is confounded is not the outcome in itself. Like the thing that is confounded is the threshold, which I have never heard about before. It's really weird, but I guess like it's something specific to this case. And so I'm thinking like, what could be an alternative explanation for the fact that you have like a lower threshold for some individuals than others, right? Could there be some confounder that we're missing here? Do you think that could be the case? I cannot think of one like right away, but I'm just wondering if you had thought about this when looking at this research.
Yeah, so the idea is that the only thing that should affect the threshold is something policy relevant. And so it could be the case in different jurisdictions, I might just systematically have lower thresholds because I have more policing resources, or I care more about that relative value of getting contraband versus the relative cost of searching people. And so in different jurisdictions, I could have different thresholds, and I could have different demographic distributions across jurisdictions. And so that could be related to thresholds. And so if I aggregate up to a single jurisdiction, or if I aggregate this up, then I could inadvertently discover a lower average threshold. So that's one possibility. We account for that. And so that's not something that is happening here. Another possibility is, let's say that when I conduct a search, not all searches are equal, but when I conduct a search for hard drugs, that's a very different thing than if I conduct a search for, or let's say drugs versus weapons. So if I conduct a search for weapons, maybe I have a lower threshold than if I conduct a search for drugs. And when I'm conducting that search, there's a demographic difference in why I'm conducting those searches. So again, that's a possibility. The vast majority of searches are for drugs, and so we don't think that's driving our results. And so it's hard to know exactly. It's hard to rule out everything. That's why I want to caveat this and say this is kind of the nature of statistical analysis, that we are building evidence, but it's not obviously a complete open and shut case. But my sense is that we're not missing some super important factor that would be driving this type of result.
Yeah, super helpful. I mean, to be honest with you, I think this is super interesting, super robust. I'm just trying to think about what are the limitations here, and what you said makes total sense. So thanks a lot.
Great, thanks for the question. Okay, so so I've been talking a little bit. I've been talking mostly about these self-stim results. I haven't really talked so much about the model. And I just want to highlight why, where is the computer science here? A lot of this is statistics, and we haven't really talked about these computational ideas. So just to give you just a little bit of taste of where the computational difficulty comes in, is that the model inference itself is carried out with Hamiltonian Monte Carlo. And if we model risk distributions as beta distributions, inference can take quite a long time, so anywhere from a few hours to even a day for some of these larger models on a relatively beefy cluster. And so this was problematic, especially when we were trying to scale it up. And so we introduced a new family of what we call discriminant distributions, which have better computational properties. And so in particular, it's easier to compute conditional means under these distributions. And making this switch from beta distributions to discriminant distributions resulted in the 100x speed up in inference time. And so that was like this was something that was important to us to make sure that these were computationally efficient tests. And so now you can run this on your laptop, and other jurisdictions can run this on your laptop within a couple minutes, even a few seconds in some cases, rather than getting these big clusters and running these things overnight. Okay, so again, one of the reasons we cared so much about that computational efficiency is that we wanted to scale this to the entire country, and this was really the way this this whole project started. Is I think this is one of the first things I got involved in when I was at Stanford about 6-7 years ago. Is that we became interested in analyzing traffic stops all across the country. We wanted to understand these patterns of policing. And at the time, there was no data set. That there were a few sporadic data sets, like New York has some data, a few other cities have data, but there is no national data set of these types of records. So we just started collecting them, filing public records requests. And at the time, I was like, okay, this will maybe take us a few months, a year. We'll just file these requests. About 6 years later, probably my conservative estimate is 10,000 hours of work later, and a big team of people collecting this information, fighting back with the public records agencies to hand over the information, standardizing the information. We ultimately got about 200 million traffic stop records that we've re-released and standardized, and what we now call the Open Policing Project. So I'm going to talk about our analysis of about 100 million of those traffic stop records from 21 state patrol agencies and 35 municipal police departments. And in the process of that, along the way, we discovered this problem of inframarginality. And so this was really this organic process where we started out, we saying we want to understand discrimination in policing. There was no data. And so we collected that data set. When we started analyzing that in the early years, we realized that we were seeing all these funny patterns, these counterintuitive patterns. And so then we dug into it. We discovered this problem of inframarginality. We addressed that. And then we realized that our methods didn't totally scale to this big data set. So we had to address that problem. And now we're popping up back to this problem that we originally wanted to address, at the beginning of this long journey. Okay, so we applied our threshold test, and we found evidence that Black and Hispanic drivers across the country were searched on the basis of less evidence than white drivers, and this was a result that we just published earlier this year. And so in some ways, this is a testament to applying rigorous statistical analysis, computational ideas, data collection to address this important policy problem. But on the flip side, it's a little bit underwhelming. We did all this work, and what do we conclude at the end of the day? We conclude that there's discrimination in police stops. And it's like, well, that feels like something that we probably should have just known ahead of time. And this was really something that I thought about for a long time. And I was trying to understand, what is the role of statistics in reform? That we were not doing this to write a paper. Obviously that's part of why we're doing this, but our larger goal in doing this work was to drive reform, or at least understand the patterns of policing, so that we could aid these efforts to improve these types of practices. And our top line result was really just confirming what a lot of people already knew. And so we're thinking hard about how, is there a role of statistics in this type of work? And I arguably a little bit biased here, but I do think there's a role of statistics here, and I'll try to lay out some of the ways that statistics can help. But I also want to flag up front that I don't think statistics is the only way. I think in some of these examples I'll show are really in close partnership with community groups, and so I don't want to kind of, I want to at least telegraph up front that this is really one of many complementary ways to drive reform. Okay, so one way that we found that was successful for improving outcomes is partnering with media organizations to really inform the public that these types of patterns are happening. So in one particular case last year, we worked with the LA Times. They were in the midst of doing a year-long investigation of LAPD to try to understand what are those patterns of policing. And actually, quite surprisingly to me, they ended up using our threshold test, this big structural model to infer patterns of discrimination at the LAPD. And they couple that analysis with these interviews, with these compelling interviews of people in the community to highlight this issue. And perhaps even more surprising to me, the LAPD responded. And they responded by drastically cutting back on pulling over random vehicles. And in particular, when they responded, they cited these statistics as informing that decision. So again, I want to make sure that we're not taking too much credit for that outcome, but I do think the statistics played at least some role in driving reform in that particular case, along with these efforts of the community groups and the LA Times reporters in particular. So another way in which I think statistics can help drive reform is by working in partnership with law enforcement agencies, and these are difficult relationships. They're competing interests, they're competing incentives at play here, and so I think these can be fraught relationships. At the same time, I think they can also be productive ways to drive reform. And so one particular project that we worked on was with the Nashville Metropolitan Police Department. At the time that we got started with them in 2017, the per capita stop rate was about 7 times the national average. So the stop rate was about 1 stop for every 2 people in the city per year. So that's quite a bit. This was quite a bit of traffic stops that were happening in the city. Now, when we Black drivers were per capita stopped about 55% or 50% more often than white drivers, 45% more often than white drivers. And when we further broke this up by moving violations and non-moving violations, so non-moving violations are things like broken taillights, broken license plate lights, registration, tinted windows, these types of non-moving violations, we found that Black drivers were 70% more likely to be stopped than white drivers. So quite a large disparity in these non-moving violations, already very high base rate. And so when we, kind of in a series of conversations with the police department, we ultimately figured out that their theory of policing was really something akin to a broken windows idea, that the point of stopping people, particularly for these non-moving violations, was not traffic safety per se, but the idea was that this act would help curtail more serious crime like burglary. And so this was their theory of policing. It wasn't explicitly articulated in many ways, but when we through the series of conversations, we're like, this is why they were conducting these types of stops. And so we looked at that rationale. So once we understood that this was the rationale for conducting those types of non-moving violation stops, we looked at the data and we found no evidence that non-moving violation stops led to either short-term or long-term reductions in serious crime. And so based on that, we recommended that Nashville dramatically reduce these stops, both because they would significantly reduce racial disparities, and also because we didn't think that there would be a cost to public safety, which was, again, their stated rationale for conducting these types of stops. To their credit, they did that. So after this report was released, officers recorded about 70%, 75% fewer stops in the next year. There's about a 70% immediate reduction, and now it's about a 75% reduction in traffic stops in the city. So it's a quite significant reduction in stops. And again, I think this was at least in part driven by this type of statistical analysis that was tailored to that local theory of policing. Okay, so now I want to, before jumping to this the second part of the talk, I just want to pause to see if there are any questions or comments. Okay.
I think I might have one.
Yes. Please.
Yeah. So I think this is really interesting. The question that you raised about the role of stats in this space, because at first you were, you were basically saying, oh, we were discovering stuff that people already know, especially if you talk to people in the African American community, we more or less could have told you this without running one single model here, right? But I think what it points to, the sort of impacts that you've shown that your reports have had, sort of speaks to perhaps, and maybe I'm just throwing this out here as a provocation, is this valuation of types of ways of knowing in society, which is like anything that is statistical or quantifiable, right? People automatically tend to trust more or less. And so these ways of knowing are, privileged in academia in ways that, an ordinary community group does not have access to, even though they know the same thing, right? So, and I think when you look at some of the larger challenges with algorithms in society, right, it's this idea that, an algorithm or, any type of statistical ways of knowing are somehow better, right? So in some ways, if you step back, it's like, this is good, but it's also reinforcing this larger challenge, isn't it? And I'm just throwing that out there as a provocation. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right, and this is what I struggled with myself in doing this type of work, is that I think we went into it thinking that we might discover something new, and I think I was admittedly naive at that time. We just basically came out, the top level finding was there's discrimination. And there wasn't, I think there was something new in the sense that this was not localized to any particular area. It was like quite widespread. Even the kind of magnitude of these effects were similar all across the country. And again, you can say, is that, probably we already sort of know that, or we should know that. And I just, and that's where we started. And it was quite discouraging to me that's like, I didn't want that to be where we ended. And I think you're right that we have had impact, but some of that impact is because other people value this type of analysis to drive them to change. And so it's something that I've been pushing back a lot. Like, a lot of departments now come to us and they say, can you do an analysis to help us improve? And I'm saying, well, are you already ready to improve? Because if you are, why don't you do something first? And then we can talk about other things that you might consider doing that you haven't thought about already. But if you're worried about racial disparities, the first thing you can do is just cut back on policing. It's like, that's an easy thing to do. That's not something, at least easy in theory, to do. You don't need a big, statistical model to tell you that you're over policing certain neighborhoods. That's like something you can do. And so that's like kind of how I approach a lot of these engagements now. But I think there's also a limit to that, because not, as you might imagine, a lot of places bristle with that. And they're like, no, it's like, we want to see these numbers first. And now you're like stuck in this kind of hard place. You're like, do you show them something to kind of get them to change, or do you hope that they just do this right thing before they see the numbers? And it's something that I personally like struggle with quite a bit. And I don't know. And like, some days I'm like, no, it's like, if this is obvious enough that we shouldn't have to look at the statistics. And some days I'm like, well, it is obvious, but not everyone recognizes it. And if you put those statistics out, it builds enough public pressure that even if it's for the wrong reason, that we can create movement on the ground. And I don't know. I don't think there's a single approach here. And I like totally respect the opinion that this shouldn't even be the primary approach, that there are all sorts of other complementary things or other things that we should focus our energy on. I tend to think that this helps on the margins. but I don't know. You know, I think there's just like complicated questions. I do think it's super important. I'm curious if other folks have thoughts on that. I mean, it's something I think a lot of us probably struggle with in academia is, are we just reifying this idea that science is this, like, science statistical analysis is the dominant way of reform?
There's also a question or comment by Jody. Jody, do you want to read it?
Sure, just unmute myself. Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment in the applications, the 3 applications that you gave us, which are very illuminating. Thank you. It seemed to me all 3 of those situations, you were maybe not validating your modeling, but you were certainly using interview data from law enforcement to complement and to really better understand what individual officers' operating theory was in terms of their own detection and measurement. Just a comment.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. I think this is something that's important to remember, that my view, and again, I don't think this is the only way, but it's the way that I tend to operate, is that effective reform requires us to step beyond the data. And I think this is for a variety of reasons, not all of it like necessarily good, but I think you have to talk to people, you have to hear what they're saying, and you have to like really make them understand that you're not looking at the data in some vacuum, in that you can't possibly understand the situations that they're facing. Like, I think we have to go beyond that simple, at the computer, crunching numbers, and then making these statements. I think we have to talk to the people, the decision makers, community members, people who are affected by these policing behaviors. We have to talk to everybody if we're serious about reform. I think that's just like a necessary component. Otherwise, we can put the numbers out, and this is what we did in our first paper. We put the numbers out, and it gets a lot of attention, but I don't think it ultimately drives reform. It's too easy to say that this is an aggregate number. It doesn't apply to my jurisdiction. It doesn't capture the nuance. And I think we have to take that extra step if we really want to see change. Okay. Any other questions or comments?
Yasmin?
Sorry, was there maybe I missed that. Was there a question?
Yeah, you want to write your question on the chat and then I can read it? Okay, so she's calling back in, so maybe if you want to move on, then we'll have the question.
Okay, great. So I know I'm actually way over time, and so I think I'm going to skip this part 3 on algorithmic decision making, and I'll just wrap up by talking a little bit more about some of the interventions that we're doing on this algorithmic side. So this whole the kind of, I will tell you that the punchline of this, just to give you a preview, and if you're interested, you can read about this more offline, is that what we're arguing is that many of these traditional mathematical measures of fairness can be poor proxies for detecting discrimination. And moreover, that attempts using these measures as design principles for constructing algorithms can lead to discriminatory algorithms in this kind of perverse fashion. And the statistical idea is that most of these definitions suffer from the exact same problem of informarginality that we saw in the human decision-making context. And so that same reason for why outcome tests can be misleading measures of discrimination, these standard statistical measures of discrimination for algorithms can also mislead us, and in some cases lead us to be discriminatory even when we intend not to be. And so that's just the preview of that work. If you're interested, feel free to follow up with me afterwards. And also these papers are posted online. So I do want to skip through this, and I'm just going to jump to the end and talk about some of our algorithmic interventions for reducing inequality. So a lot of our work that we're doing is both trying to understand discrimination in human decision-making contexts, to understand how do we construct equitable algorithms, and then finally deploying these algorithms in an equitable fashion to reduce inequality in the world. So that's kind of how I broadly think about this space, understanding human behavior, understanding how to design equitable algorithms and then deploying these types of equitable algorithms for various applications. So I want to tell you very quickly about 2 recent applications. The first is what we call a race-blind charging tool that we deployed in San Francisco's District Attorney's Office last year. And here the idea is that when individuals are arrested, prosecutors have to make this high-stakes decision about whether or not to charge that individual with the offense. If they charge them, that starts this whole kind of series of decisions and outcomes that often isn't going to end well for the individual. They're almost always going to be convicted at that point, and in many cases there's going to be incarceration or other sorts of penalties. And if they decide not to charge, then for all intents and purposes, that event didn't happen as far as the criminal justice system is concerned. And so this is an extremely high stakes decision about whether or not to charge an individual. The way this is typically made is that intake attorneys or other attorneys in a prosecutor's office, they read police narratives, and then they make an up or down decision about whether or not they believe that they can establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, or if this case would be the interest of justice to pursue. And this is based on all the available information at the time. In particular, the race of the individuals involved. And so what we developed is a natural language processing tool that automatically masks race-related information and their proxies from police narratives. So this platform has been used by San Francisco DA's office to review incoming felony arrests when deciding whether or not to file charges. So the way this works, let me just give you a quick example. So this is all a fictitious example, but it's structurally very similar to a real police report. So we have all this information, for example, the reporting officers' names, the neighborhoods, physical descriptors of the individuals involved. And so this is the plain text that an intake attorney might see, and we redact this so that it looks like this. So we redact physical features, we redact location because location is often an indicator of the race of the individuals involved. We redact officer names because officers are often stationed in a handful of locations, and then you can infer from the officer name what location it is, and from what location it is to the race of the individual. So we redact all this information, and then based on this redacted information, the attorneys are making a preliminary decision on whether or not to bring charges. So the idea here is to reduce what's called disparate treatment. So to try to reduce the likelihood that race directly or perceptions of race directly influence that charging decision. But it's important to remember that this type of process does not reduce disparate impact, another form of discrimination which might come about from unjust charging policies. So let's say, for example, that our policy is to, and this is kind of a classic example, our policy is to charge crack cocaine but not powder cocaine, irrespective of the race of the individuals involved. Let's say that's our race neutral, in some way our race neutral policy. This type of intervention would not help with that policy at all, because race, as I described it, was not directly influencing the decision. But as we all likely know, that this is a deeply problematic practice, in that even though we might think that crack cocaine and powder cocaine are similar and should be treated similarly, in fact, powder cocaine is much more prevalent among white individuals and crack cocaine is much more prevalent among African-American individuals. And so that disparate impact that policy could create is a form of discrimination that we're not addressing here. And so, again, I want to be very clear about what we can do and what we can't do with these types of algorithmic interventions. Another thing that we can't do is we can't change who is arrested and who even has that possibility of being charged. We have nothing. This type of intervention is only has some relevance for that charging decision, not anything that is coming before that. So we have to contextualize, again, what these types of interventions can and can't do. So this is an intervention that has been starting to get a lot of traction across the country, it seems like something that's very intuitive, something, even though it doesn't solve many of these issues in criminal justice, it does seem to address this this idea of blind justice that many of us, that probably resonates with many of us. And so this is an intervention that we're starting to roll out in other places across the country now. So now the second and final example I want to give you is what we call algorithmic nudges. So here we're working with the Santa Clara County Public Defender Office to help their clients make it to court. And so one reason that people don't make it to court, so their clients have upcoming court dates. If you miss court, then all these harsh penalties, including potentially incarceration, result from that, even though it's really like, in many cases, it's like missing a doctor's appointment. This isn't something like people are trying to flee the jurisdiction. Like that's there's this idea that if you miss court, that something is gone, like you're really doing this intentionally in this nefarious fashion. Almost never is that the case. Really, people are missing court for simple reasons, like they didn't remember that they have a court date, that they're juggling these complex lives, and they just didn't know that this was the time and place that they have to go. They didn't have transportation to get to court. They don't have a car. They don't have access to a car. They don't have easy access to public transportation. And so we're trying to address these low-level common issues that people have to ameliorate these quite consequential punitive outcomes that can happen for missing court. And so the way we're doing this is by sending personalized text message reminders to individuals to tell them about their court dates, and then allocating free rideshare to those individuals. We call a Lyft on their behalf, and we are telling them, okay, this car is going to pick you up, take you to court, take you back home. You don't have to worry about public transportation. You don't have to worry about the fact that finding your own transportation. We're going to get you there, and we're going to get you back home. And what we're doing is using these ideas from reinforcement learning to efficiently personalize and allocate our limited transportation resources to ensure better social outcomes. So now, just wrapping up, our goal in a lot of this work is to reduce inequality, to reduce social stratification. We're doing this in this three-pronged way. The first is data collection and data integration. The Open Policing Project is one example of that. The second is analyzing the data to try to identify sources of inequality. So I talked about some of our work on the human decision-making context. We're doing something similar in designing these equitable algorithms. And then the third is deploying these algorithms, designing and deploying these algorithms. In here, I just gave you two quick examples on race-blind charging and these pretrial text message court date reminders and transportation to help people get to court. So if you're interested, so I'll end with that. And if you're interested in learning more about our work, please check out our webpage at Stanford. And we have a lot of other projects that we describe and ways that folks can get involved. So thanks for listening. Thanks.
Thank you, Sharad. It was a great talk. I think now we have I guess we're at the edge of the hour. But in case anyone has questions.
I can jump in here. I just been told that Sharad will be staying a little bit longer after the half an hour, to take questions. So if people want to stick around and have a longer Q&A, they're welcome to.
Yeah, I'm very happy to stick around and talk to folks. Looks like there might be some.
I have a sort of just brief clarification question. I think you might have gone over this, but I missed it. Are you making any distinctions between different jurisdictions and how you're sort of predicting the probability of a search?
I'm sorry, I couldn't. There's the garbage truck is acting up again outside my window. So
No worries, no worries. My question was just, are you making distinctions between jurisdictions when you're predicting probability of a search, right? Like, for example, like, are you aggregating across all jurisdictions at once, or are you doing regional distributions?
Yeah, so we are we're using a hierarchical model. So I guess the short answer is that we're doing something in between, and so we're allowing for geographic heterogeneity, but we're also pooling our estimates so that we can learn from other jurisdictions that seem similar.
Great, thank you.
I have a question for you, actually. Could you talk a little bit about sort of like the ethical thinking you go through when you decide to work with a police department? And just, I know you mentioned you ask them to make change before you participate, right? But if you could just talk a little bit more about that and what that looks like to you and your practice.
Yeah, so it's a super good question, and it's really something that we're still trying to figure out. And in one reason that we're thinking a lot more about this is that we started this Seed Grant program recently, where before a lot of our partnerships were kind of through our social networks. I'm based in San Francisco, and so a lot of my connections are in California, and I used to live in New York, and so these are kind of places that we've worked in the past. But we wanted to formalize that process and allow other jurisdictions, police departments, district attorneys, public defenders, come to us with ways that we might be able to partner. And so we created this, I would say it's a relatively novel program, and you can read about this on our website, where we fund agencies, government agencies or community groups to drive reform, and we also work with them for a couple years to make that happen. And so this might mean something like the type of analysis that we're doing in Nashville, or the type of algorithmic nudges that we're rolling out. A lot of that is coming in through these seed grant programs. And so in that process, we really try to vet our partners and make sure that they're committed to the same goals that we have as an organization. And it's not to say that our goals are the only goals that are valuable here, but we do have our goals, at least in this space, are to reduce police contact and to reduce incarceration. And so we are asking for a commitment to do that upfront before we start any of the work. And again, that's not the only thing that I think needs to happen with policing reform or criminal justice reform. And I think our approach is not the only way to do that, but that is the place where we're coming from. And so we only work with partners who have not only a clear commitment, but ideally a track record of pushing in that direction. But at the end of the day, there's a leap of faith. And we don't know what's going to happen, and we don't ultimately have decision-making power. We have to, we enter on good faith. We make our recommendations. We maybe roll out an algorithm, or we suggest that they roll out an algorithm, but we don't have control of it at the end of the day. And so there is this level of faith, and that, we struggle about where should we draw the line. And another kind of complicated ethical issue here is that some of the places where we think we can have the most impact are the places with the worst histories of policing. And now we have to make this choice. It's like, do we want to partner with those agencies? Like Nashville is a good example, where there are 7 times the national average in per capita police stops, clearly much more problematic than the average department. But when we worked with them, we were able to at least help contribute to 75% reduction in traffic stops. And so it's like working with these jurisdictions that have particularly serious problems can also lead to particularly beneficial outcomes, but it's uncomfortable. And we don't always know where we're gonna draw the line there.
Okay. Great. And so I think we've had a few questions come in the chat, so I'm just going to read them out loud so that it's held for the recording at least. So Anissa mentioned, you talked about the role of statistics for reform, but what do you think is the role of statistics for abolition?
That's a good question. So I think there's a spectrum, and I think a lot of the policies that we're pushing are dramatically. Well, actually, let me take a second and think about this. I think a lot of the statistics are pointing in the same direction as significantly reducing police contact with the public and significantly reducing incarceration. I think that's what much of the statistical evidence is pointing to. That's what our work is pointing to. That's the type of work that we are advocating when we work with agencies. Now, the statistics themselves, or at least the ones that I have seen, are not pointing to ending policing entirely. And so if that is the definition of abolition, I think there's going to be some tension. Now, I think there's an alternative definition of abolition, which is something of the form that what we imagine our criminal justice system to look like is so different from the one that we currently have that for all intents and purposes, we've eliminated that old system and built a new one. Now, in that sense, again, I think that there is this complementarity between the statistical analysis and this broader reform. But I don't want to be kind of Pollyanna-ish and say that these are all like pointing in the same direction. I do think at some point there is an inherent tension in what the statistical analysis is showing and what some of these calls for reform look like. And that's not to say that one is normatively better than the other, but I do think it's important to recognize when they're pointing in the same direction and when they're not always pointing in the same direction. So I appreciate the question. I think it's a good one.
Okay. And then we have another question from Aishwarya. Can you speak about how these models can be applied in New York and if urban renewal policies have been integrated within this model?
Sorry, I'm missing. I think I only heard part of that question. Do you mind repeating?
Yeah, I can do it again. Okay, can you speak about how these models can be applied in New York and if urban renewal policies have been integrated with this model?
So this model of kind of like police accountability or and that side of things, is that the idea?
I don't know. Are you still here, the asker?
Yeah,
Oh,
okay,
yeah.
I'm happy to talk to that. So that's, yeah, so it sounds like, I think there are many kind of ways to answer this question. So one thing that we did in New York, actually this was a little bit tangential to our work, but it's like kind of points in the same direction, is that we were looking at stop and frisk, who everybody in New York is familiar with. And this, I think it was right around 2013 or so when this was dramatically reduced. And part of what was driving, I think there were lots of factors driving that. Part of what was driving that was this class action lawsuit in New York that was bolstered by statistical evidence of 4th and 14th Amendment constitutional violations in the way that stop and frisk was carried out. So we did our own analysis of a statistical analysis of those patterns as well, and we corroborated these types of constitutional violations in stop and frisk. Our work didn't directly impact that that court case. It came a little bit afterwards, but I do think this way of thinking can be used all across the country and in New York in particular for driving police reform, with the caveat, of course, that this is really one of many complementary ways to address these issues.
Okay. Okay. And then the other question is from Bill Weeks, who asked whether this approach might be useful in healthcare. And so they mentioned there are clear race-based disparities in quality and health outcomes and who gets what services, so perhaps a threshold problem. I worry that some of the impact might be that Black patients go to lower quality providers / healthcare organizations, possibly because they may be on worse insurances like Medicaid. Any thoughts on application in healthcare?
Yeah, so this is really good. So this is really a question of something that we're actively working on right now. So we're in the process of understanding organ allocation, so particularly kidney transplantation. And so there's an algorithm behind the scenes that is matching donors with or kidneys with recipients, and there's worry that the way this particular algorithm is constructed is that it leads to disparate impacts. And so that's one aspect of what we're looking at. We're also looking at, on the public health side, it's a little bit different, but I think it's related. We're looking at the allocation of SNAP benefits. So this is what's formerly called food stamps. And there, again, there is this question of how do you not only allocate these resources, but how do you advertise the existence of these resources? So we have a project, we're partnering with Code for America that is running part of the SNAP program in California. And one of the big problems there is how do you advertise to people in an equitable way? And so in particular, Spanish language individuals are not always as aware of their eligibility for SNAP benefits because there's just less advertising. But the flip side is it's more costly it's more costly to advertise to Spanish language speakers. And so there's this ethical trade-off that we have to make that is not dissimilar from a trolley problem, if you've heard of these things, that there's a fixed budget. And now we have to figure out how do we allocate this fixed advertising budget to make sure that we are both getting a lot of people in the door and getting these SNAP benefits allocated to them, but also doing so in a way that is broadly equitable and that we're not reinforcing structural inequalities, for example, based on language preference. So those are just kind of two quick health examples that we're working on.
So I don't see any more questions in. So for the, I think, can you just clarify on that SNAP piece? Is the idea that like there's like a limited budget for advertising? Why don't they choose a different way of communicating to people?
And so in theory, you're always going to have some limit. It's like you have to communicate in some way. There's some budget, and now that budget might be money, that budget might be time. There's just like some like limit in how you're going to communicate. And now the issue is that if one group is harder to communicate with, which can be the case for a variety of reasons, like language barrier is one particular reason that we're looking at, then you have to face this trade-off. And so it's coming with this assumption, which I think is true in this case, and it's probably true in many cases, that many of the groups that we're interested in allocating resources to are also the ones that are hardest to reach. Does that make sense? Am I answering the question?
No, I just like don't understand how there's like how there aren't like Spanish speaking like government officials or like universal design type of ideas.
So the idea here is that the application itself is in Spanish and in English, but the way that it's advertised is through like Google Ads or Facebook Ads, and it's more expensive to target Spanish language speakers on Google than English language speakers. And the reason, I mean, there are kind of a variety of reasons, but one way of thinking about that is that there's relatively high demand for the limited number of Spanish language speakers online. So it drives up prices.
Yeah.
So another kind of place where this has been pointed out is that it's more expensive to advertise to women online. And so this has all sorts of implications for job ads. And so, for example, for STEM recruiting, so this is one of these studies that was done, I think last year, that because it's more expensive to advertise to women online, if you just put a STEM ad out, you're going to get a disproportionate share of men responding to that ad because more are seeing it. Which is a problem. Again, I'm not saying that these are, I'm not trying to justify these inherent differences, but given those differences that are hard for us on the outside to control, what do we do? And that's the problem that we're faced with.
Okay. Okay, so I think Eric Chandler also had a question.
Yeah, I do, and thanks for staying over time to do this extended QA. So I thought that in the Santa Clara text messaging court date project, there's a very interesting description of the court's rationale for the consequences of missing the date. And I was wondering if you could talk more about like the design and ideation phase of this project, where was that a shared understanding that the punishment or that the motivations for missing a court date are not maybe in line with the consequences?
It's funny. I mean, maybe my slightly cynical view is very few of these things are like intentional design choices. Like, we see extremely harsh punishment in many cases. And I think one would be hard pressed to say that that was an intentional response to a policy need. And so it wasn't even, so originally, at least at the federal level, originally the only reason for detaining people was flight risk. So a fear that people wouldn't show up to their court dates. And then in 1984, the federal guidelines changed, and so then it started becoming what's called public safety risk, that people would start committing crimes pre-trial, and then that I think is like morphed into this like general fear that if people miss their court dates, then something has gone terribly wrong. Now, even the language that we use when we say flight risk, I kind of hate that term, even though it's a common term. It makes it sound like someone is putting on a disguise and like fleeing country, but that's like obviously not what's going on, or maybe I shouldn't say obvious, but that's what's not going on. That people are missing it for these mundane reasons, but we still have this system that's predicated on this idea that it is serious. And I think that's just like kind of in some ways a remnant of the way that we've thought about criminal justice for so long. It's like, but in my mind, I think the better analogy is missing a doctor's appointment. It's like you miss a doctor's appointment that actually is consequential. You miss a doctor's appointment that's like something has gone wrong, that maybe it's going to like mean someone else's spot is they're not able to use that appointment spot. But we kind of intuitively recognize that we're not going to take a punitive approach to addressing that issue. We're going to take a supportive approach to helping people make it to their appointments. And so it's just like this shift in framing the problem, which I think is very kind of common in criminal justice, that we have this punitive mindset versus like this more of a let's understand why we're not seeing the outcomes that we want to see.
So in that case, was it fair to characterize the like the courts or whoever was representing them as saying that they were willing to make it easier for people to show up at their court dates, but not willing to change the policy?
I mean, so they're different actors. I think this is the thing. The courts aren't changing. What's changing is we're partnering with the public defense agency, the Santa Clara County Public Defender Office, and these are their clients. And so their incentives are aligned to help their clients. And I would hope that everybody's incentives are aligned to help individuals with upcoming court dates. But I think reality is the incentives are not fully aligned when you're talking about the court actors or legislators.
Okay, thank you.
Claudia has put a question in the chat also. So it's on measuring performance of an algorithm well, which I think we kind of flew through. It seems like you've developed a few tools to measure fairness along a particular axis. So race in this case, and considering hit rate in the context of unknown distributions. What would you list those tools to be? Have you worked on some applications of these in other settings? Also thinking about healthcare, for example, a provider or a provider plan might recommend surgery at a higher rates for one group versus another race group insurance type with same input info.
Yeah, so it's a great question. And I think for me, again, my thinking kind of has evolved over the years, and I suspect it'll evolve more in the future. The way I currently think about these things is not as tools to evaluate the fairness of algorithms, but we think of algorithms as policy interventions, and then we evaluate those the same way that we'd evaluate any policy intervention. And so the idea here is we say, if we were to roll this thing out, what outcomes are we likely to see, and are we happy with those outcomes? And so that it's a very kind of non-computational way of thinking about evaluating the equity of algorithms by really just shifting the frame and saying algorithms, there's nothing really special about algorithms other than that they're a formalized system for making decisions, which we can think of as a formalized policy. And so once we think of it as a formalized policy, we can evaluate the same way that we evaluate any policy, regardless of whether or not that was based at some point on a statistical analysis.
Okay. And then, Aishwarya, I don't know if you want to clarify your question, but there's comment on causal factors.
Yeah. So I was just thinking about causality, because I feel like the solution kind of lies within the problem. The fact that, policies can be modeled in a way where you can sort of nip the issues in the right of the bud, and then sort of, it's just, I think causality is catching up with respect to computational algorithms. So I was wondering if that is something that your research is geared toward. Thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's a really good question. It's definitely something that we have worked on a lot recently. And here, this actually dovetails nicely with this last question in response, is that in order to make an informed decision on whether or not a policy is equitable or useful in any kind of broader sense, we need to estimate the likely impact of rolling out that policy. So this is a causal question. It's like, if we were to deploy this algorithm or this policy, what is likely to happen? And that is a difficult causal question, but I think it's one that we have to answer if we are to make these types of informed decisions before we roll out a policy. So that's like central to how I personally think about these decisions.
Super. Thank you so much.
I think that was it for the chat questions. If anyone wants to raise their hand or just get on. Anything, Bueller? We got a thank you in the chat. Yeah, and I just want to say thank you, Sharad, for staying over time and for speaking with us. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to seeing the rest of everything you're working on.
Great, thanks everybody for attending and for the invitation to speak. I enjoyed talking with you all.
Okay, thank you.